Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming along. We really appreciate your support. We've got a very exciting evening to hear about Anna Maria Dell'Osso, but a little bit about her a little bit later on. I just wanted to, first of all, we should thank Antonio Luciano. He's not here this evening, but he's produces those wonderful movies that we show before each event. Of various areas showing food trails, wine, and all sorts of delicious-looking Italian food. So we thank Antonio for. He's also our committee member, and we really appreciate his input. Now I'm going to ask Pina to come up, and she can tell you a little bit about Anna Maria, and then Anna Maria will come up and tell you all about it all. Thank you.
Buonasera and benvenuti a tutti. So good evening and welcome to everyone. So Anna Maria was born in Melbourne into a family of Italian storytellers from the mountain villages of Abruzzo, which is where my parents come from too. After studying music and social work, she lived for a time in New Zealand, where she worked as a cadet journalist by day and a violinist in the local symphony orchestra by night. So multi-talented lady here. So welcome. Please welcome Anna Maria.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to Historical Society. I'm really, really thrilled to be back in the homeland of Leichhardt. It's really lovely. So even though I'm going to talk tonight about a particular little girl who grew up in a particular place called Melbourne, and who came from a particular part of the Italian diaspora, I think that it has a lot in common with many of the things that we're looking at today, and will continue to look at as long as we are searching for home as human beings. I had there a lesson that I took at the Dante Alighieri Society recently. I snapped the board. It's me doing my verbs. We're all trying to learn verbs, very basic Italian. I've managed to make my way through book 1 of Espresso, and I'm trying to relearn my language, which is a very strange situation to be in. When I was a little girl, I spoke nothing but the dialect of my parents from the Abruzzo region of Italy. So imagine the shock when I turned up on the first day of school at Collingwood Primary School in Melbourne, region of the great Collingwood Football Club, of course, and discovered there was a whole new world outside of the little world I'd grown up in, and it had another language, and I didn't understand any of it. And in my head, in my 5-year-old brain, that meant dropping Italian. As a culture, I think the Italian immigrants were very busy getting on with life and getting on with working. My parents had their own worries, they had a lot of work that they did, and they weren't particularly strict with me about keeping up language. They did try to send me to Saturday school, but I at that time was very much in love with the violin and playing music, and so what would happen was my brother would pass me my violin out of the window while I was supposed to be going to Italian class, and I would head off to orchestra class instead, Melbourne Youth Orchestra. My parents have both passed away in the early 200s. I realised that I had an opportunity now to make my own relationship with Italy, but that I wanted to have a relationship with the modern Italy, the Italy of today, Italy of now, right now. And so I've decided to start again and learn Italian, and it's been the most strange thing psychologically. I can't describe it, but it's really great. And now I'm extremely excited to be going to Perugia. I couldn't believe I won this scholarship. I had to write my very first essay in Italian, and I realised that I'm, just as able to be quite fanciful in Italian as I am in English. So it was great. And one of the reasons that I am going to Perugia is to chase my mother's a novel that she has written in Italian called Syria lo sapeva, that Syria knew it all. So that's my plan to go to Perugia and hopefully write about my search. The Abruzzo. I wrote a piece about the Abruzzo. Here we are. It is quite a landscape of mountainous beauty. The mountainous Abruzzo is beautiful in a wild way that is starkly different to the Italy of Francis May's and Bella Tuscany. Today it's emerging as a tourist destination. Its abandoned properties in hillside villages are being restored by British superannuants, but for centuries it was a poor and undeveloped region, part of the long-suffering Mezzogiorno, in soul, in politics and economics, if not in strict geography, for it's only a few hours east from Rome, straight across the calf of Italy. L'Aquila, which means the eagle, is the capital city of the Abruzzo, and the name of one of its 4 provinces. The others are Chieti, Pescara, and Teramo. And my father came from Abruzzo as well, from the small town of Polutri. My mother, who in her later years was inspired to write after seeing that I was writing, she thought, oh, I can write too. So she began doing her own thing. She told us, these are her words, from its high hills you can see all the small towns below. Their lights twinkle at night as if the stars were bending down from the sky to kiss the earth. It's lovely to feel the breeze from La Maiella, and your gaze can't help but admire the Adriatic Sea. It really makes you want to sing when you hear the sound of the bells, which, as evening falls, calls everyone to prayer. So, it all began with my dad, the immigration to Australia. After World War II, returning to the devastated bombed villages of central Italy was a depressing business. So he firstly arrived in Fremantle in Western Australia, and I wrote a little bit about that in Songs of the Suitcase. Families are people who carry the same baggage over generations and continents. My family came out of an immigrant's suitcase which was hauled onto the wharf at Fremantle, Western Australia in 1951. The handle of that first suitcase from which we were dragged out and raised up was held by my father, a single man, alone. After a glass or two of his roughest guts homemade red wine, which you had to pretend to love or you wouldn't get a word out of him, my father would tell you stories of his first day in Australia, how he dragged that suitcase in 41-degree heat, how he sweated rivers in his best woolen suit, which he'd had specially made in Naples for his disembarkation in Australia. And so it was in Melbourne that my natal family, mamma e papa, sorella and fratello, was finally shaken out of all the luggage that followed, those suitcases, trunks, airmail letters, packages of cloth, gold jewellery and pre-war photographs wrapped in tissue paper. We cleared a space in a dark old house in Collingwood and set up a life, a job in the Melbourne breweries, a night shift at the sweets factory for my mother, a Simpsons Ringer washing machine, 2 dozen nappies and a crate of tomatoes from a paisano's orchard at Greensborough, a green enamelled cooker gas stove and 3 kids. Only 3 kids, you know, because to have more kids you needed le nonne, you needed the grandmothers, and our grandmothers were not part of our luggage in this country, they weren't part of the deal. So this is a photo of my mother Lydia. This was her engagement photograph that was done in a studio, and I think she looks rather gorgeous. There's she and Dad, their sort of honeymooning thing. You'll notice Dad's quite a bit smaller than my mum if you look down at their feet. I think they look really cute. He was also smoking at the time, but he stopped smoking pretty soon after we were born, which I'm very thankful for because he lived to be a good age. Otherwise he wouldn't have, because he used to smoke like a chimney. So I remember that dress in particular because my sister and I used to wear it for dress-ups. As soon as Mum and Dad left the house, we'd take out all their stuff and wear it all, and peek in the blue trunk that had a lot of memorabilia in it. However, their marriage was unusual in that that was a proxy wedding. Even my children didn't know what that was. At the time, it was very traditional for young village women to accept sort of letter relationships from men who were searching in Australia, who were searching, Italian men, that is, searching for a bride to set up a house in Australia. And of course, no Italian family was going to let their daughter head off across the wild seas without a ring firmly planted on her finger and to be married in the eyes of God. So that being impossible, physically, there was a stand-in for the groom, and that is the proxy part of the marriage ceremony where my mother's brother stood in for the groom. There she is in her post-war blue suit. Life was tough, and this wasn't an extravagant wedding by any means. My mother did write a poem. An extraordinary propaganda convinced me to migrate to Australia, and now the yearned-for moment had come for a girl who was to become a wife and then a mother. On that freezing, starry morning, I felt regret at having signed those papers. I went down the steps of my house for the last time, just like a child. The square was full of people. There was a sombre murmur. The car pulls up, a kiss and a hug, and tears roll down my face and down the faces of relatives and friends. I sat down, my mind cluttered with thoughts, but I mustered the courage to go on. The car engine purred softly, as if about to weep. I looked out of the window into the street. I saw the last houses flashing by. I looked at my beautiful town under the starry sky. Then we crossed the river, and I saw no one anymore. Farewell. I hope we meet again in better times. And that was the last she saw of her village for a good 20 years. Yeah. And then we came along, my little brother, that's my father, and that's me with my bow on my hair, and Mother made all our clothes because she was a wonderful seamstress. And I just love this photo. This is one of my faves because in order to, there were a lot of naysayers about my father moving to Australia. A lot of, Don won't do that well, all that kind of thing. So they were very anxious to prove that things were going extremely well for them in Australia. Thanks very much. So this is a posed photograph in front of, it looks like we're off on our jet-setting family holiday here. Actually, it's a cardboard plane. It's I don't know where this is, but it's not a real plane, but it's fabulous. There we are as part of the 60s jet set. By then, my uncle, Vincenzo, had also arrived, the guy that was my mother's proxy for her wedding. By the way, the church was never that happy about these proxy marriages, but they tolerated them. And with the older generation, some of them don't like to talk about it, but I don't know why not, because it's just an amazing part of history and an amazing part of the sacrifices that the older generation made in order to come to Australia. Anyway, this is the three little Delloso kids and my uncle and my mom and my father, and of course we're wearing, me and my sister are wearing our matching velveteen dresses that remain a great favourite with us. But in the photo, I often look at this photo and think, you know, my mother's already showing signs of the depression that dogged her all her life, the profound depression that I started to realise as I grew up that my mother was not like other people. She had an extra layer to her than your typical migrant woman. So I will... Yeah, my father was a very calm and even-tempered person, lovely man who worked in the breweries. You can't imagine a more Aussie job than working at Joe White Maltings in Collingwood. You know, their corporate history has changed many a time. But the old Joe White Maltings, which was started by Joe White, I really want to look into the history of that because I had the best ever Christmas parties for their workers. You get invitations that were gold-rimmed invitations, like those, you know, ones that Cinderella gets to the ball, you know, those ones, and we were just hysterically excited as kids to go along to these Christmas parties and having these exotic afternoon teas, a table laden with sandwiches, which we never saw, made of white bread and chopped into triangles and had things in them like Vegemite and peanut butter and all sorts of exotica like that we never ate. And that's my mother at the beach. And she's dressed in black because her father had passed away, and her my uncle Vincenzo, who had been at least some kind of support to her while he was in Australia, had returned to Italy. Now on the other side of the world, my cousins remember this time with their father away with very sad hearts. And when I first went to Italy and met Vincenzo's children, my cousins, they could hardly bear to hear us talking in the broken English that he still had about those times, because for them it was a tough time to be without their dad. So, but anyway, about Lydia. In around 1968, as the eldest child, I was the first to realise that there was something not entirely normal about our mother. Lydia was then only in her late 30s, but she had stopped work to take up being a full-time invalid on the daybed in Kew in Melbourne. I'd be worried about the dishes in the sink and the laundry piled around the chairs and the mantelpiece clock striking 4:30, the beds unmade and the sun sinking in that way that the Melbourne sun sinks, the southern sun sinks, in a red, cold defeat that just makes you want to cry, and with dinner not remotely done nor thought of, and with our father due home in an hour, while Lydia, who, like the Fisher King, was terribly ill to the point of death with her mysterious disease that never killed, nor could ever be diagnosed or healed the rest of her life long, Lydia would be telling us the tale of riposare or lavorare, rest or work. One day, a rusty old plough was left under an olive tree next to a half-broken wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow asked the plough, "Well, what are you doing here?" And the plough answered, "I've just ploughed the last furrow. My owner used to rest here, so I am too." The wheelbarrow then asked the olive tree, "When do you rest?" The olive tree replied, "No rest for me. I must always bear fruit, or I'll be put to the fire." Lydia was born in 1930, and she rarely spoke directly of her family relationships or what kind of a war she had, but it's more likely that she experienced trauma, because certainly by the time she was 25 and living in Australia, she had grown into a difficult character, inverted commas, prone to dark moods and controlling temper tantrums. Keeping Lydia happy tied up my father in knots all of his life, and caused friends and relatives to scatter. I always thought we had no relatives in Melbourne until I was in my 30s, when I received a letter from a cousin on my father's side who lived in Glen Waverley, but whom my mother hadn't spoken to since the early 1960s. This was particularly shocking to me, since the underlying theme of her life is of profound loneliness and emptiness. Each childbirth, including one stillbirth, increased Lydia's mood swings until, with the arrival of her last child, she was hospitalised, and we children, all under 4, were for a short time placed in care with the Salvation Army and the Catholic Church. Lydia told me, quite frankly, and many, many times, that she was an unwilling conscript to marriage and motherhood. It was her attempt to explain why she was not a loving mother and why I should not hold it against her. In the later years of her life, spurred by the publication of Songs of the Suitcase, Lydia set to writing her own book, a collection of poems called Un angolo della mia penna, which I have a few copies available for sale afterwards if you'd like to see them. They are being used as a part of some immigration studies courses around the place. I think in Melbourne, there's, I think it's being used as a recommended text, which she would be thrilled about today. Lydia was then in her 60s, and her health was precarious as usual, and she remained uneducated, having attended primary school only to the 3rd grade, and having been then placed under the tutelage of provincial convent nuns who gave farming girls an education in textiles, embroidery, religion, and, I have to say it, narrow-mindedness. Yet Lydia was able to read and recite large tracts of Dante's Inferno, and she knew her Verdi operas, and I think that's amazing. I think she was a really unusual person. And I write more about her, how complex she was. She could be complex, she could be childish, she could be spiteful and stubborn, but she certainly had brains, as we knew from her inventive tongue lashings. I was terrified of her, and looking back, it was like being raised by a teenager, a giant teenager, a 15-year-old who needed to be appeased and treated with great care. Any offence and the ground would rumble and you'd fall into crevices of molten rage, and the buildings of your little world would crash down upon you. And, you know, I think it's not too fanciful now to think that it might all have been complications of post-traumatic stress disorder, meeting a very definite tendency in Lydia to have some borderline personality traits as well. But meanwhile, I was joining the basketball team and having a good time in the multicultural 60s in Melbourne. I really like that picture because it just shows the resilience that we all had at the time, and there were many kids in that photo who came from other parts of the world as well. In the 1960s, my siblings and I were demon readers, unsupervised after school. We had nothing to do but get up to mischief on the streets, set the house on fire in cooking experiments, or go to the Kew Public Library. We all became lifelong bookworms. My brother and sister are both librarians. We lived in Packington Street, Kew, in a single-storey Victorian terrace. This is where we moved. We moved across the river in Melbourne. We're going up in the world. We're becoming middle class. And there was Mrs. Davis and her prim adult daughter on one side of us, and across the road, a tribe of red-haired Irish Australians whose laughing children tumbled out of a sunlit cottage fronted by a large garden of lawn, sweet peas and hydrangeas. There was even a white ironwork fence, a dog, and a pair of cats. Was I delivered to the wrong address? All the Enid Blyton I read suggested yes. Yes, I was. What was I doing on this side of the fence? I developed a great love of the violin, and I joined the Melbourne Youth Orchestra. In 1973, my whole life changed, and that's me on tour with the Melbourne Youth Orchestra. We went for 6 weeks around Europe, including Italy. And for the first time, I was in the driver's seat in Italy because all my friends were asking me what was going on. And surprisingly, I was able to make my way through that time. And I realised then that I really shouldn't have skipped the Italian lessons. Many of the kids in the MYO are now playing in orchestras around the world, including many in the soon-to-arrive Australian World Orchestra, which is made of all of our wonderful musicians. Musicians are actually our most neglected athletes and forgotten athletes because they have micro-muscle brilliance. That's their sport, if you like. A lot who were trained by the post-war immigrants. And because of that, I met a king of the accordion many, many years ago who lived in Lower Templestowe, and I was writing a piece about the importance of the piano accordion in Italian cultural life, especially in the Carlton of the 60s and early 70s. And there was a guy called Ugo Ceresoli who played the piano accordion and was part of the Mocambo band in Melbourne, yeah? Remember the Mocambo band, yeah. And he let me look through his collection, and he told me of accordions and music, and I think he's passed away now, sadly. Great guy. He only lived around the corner from me in Lower Templestowe. And this, to me, encapsulates the arrival of the Italian male into the streets of many a city in Australia. The two-tone shoes, the spivvy-looking hair slicked back, the eyes, that sort of cheeky, yeah, the Italians are here, stealing the Italian girls from the Aussie male. And here they come, ready to take your women, yeah. So Ugo Ceresoli told me a great story which I pinched for The King of the Accordion. Now this is fiction, I've fictionalized it, and this character is meeting his proxy bride at the ship. And this guy, Bruno, is there to sweep her off to their rented rooms in Fitzroy. "Hey, maestro," he shouted in what I imagined was his usual reckless way. "Play this cafone, una bella canzone. Maybe they have ears, you never know." So he wrestles the accordion from the inspection deck and he holds it to his shoulders, and the young Italian men around him are wolf-whistling continental style, leaning back in their shirt sleeves with insolent fingers in their mouths. "Bravo, viva l'Italia! La donna è immobile! Nessun dorma!" But Simeoni chose the fastest of his classical pieces, Il volo del Calabrone, because he didn't know how long he had before they'd send for the police to arrest him. Flight of the Bumblebee by Rimsky-Korsakov, usually played to show off the saltando and spiccato bowing of virtuoso violinists. By the end of it, the smiling officials waved him through. They look at him with respect. One of the stories he told me. Anyway, and the years passed and I decided to become a journalist. I did go to the College of the Arts in Melbourne. My love for the violin was great. I met my husband-to-be as a violin student. We played in a quartet. Then I went to study in Tasmania as well, in Hobart, with the great Jan Sedivka, another famous Czech immigrant, without whom the entire string sections of many orchestras would be much the poorer. I was working for the Sydney Morning Herald, doing reasonably well as a young journalist, when I wrote a piece about busking in Sydney. The Sydney Morning Herald just couldn't cope with the number of calls they got about that article. I don't know if anyone remembers that article, but it was called "Tread Softly, for You Tread on My Dreams." And I got my big break in Sydney journalism from that. Journalism was fun. It was really good. I had some really good times. This is one of the good times. This is me between two greats of the Labor Party, literally, having a cocktail with the great Gough Whitlam and the great Robert Tickner. The difficulties, however, of being a female journalist in journalism was a challenge very often. Not only when I first started in journalism did I have to confront a sort of Mad Men situation. It was just the most incredibly sexist times, but we didn't realise. We were young and we just did what we had to do. But this is a picture of my frustration as a journalist when I went to do a story on the Sydney Metropolitan Fire Brigade back in the day. And I wasn't allowed to ride on the fire truck because women don't ride on fire trucks. And eventually I found my voice as a writer. I mean, I was lucky enough to do a lot of different work at the Herald. I started at the Herald, I think, at the end of, just on the end of the summer of 1979. And, you know, I started the new year in the newsroom full on in 1980. And remained there for 20 years with the Fairfax papers, pretty much. Opportunities as a journalist was, I always thought as a journalist that you get these really great freebies and you get to go to all the opening nights and everything. And a lot of other journalists did get postings, postings to exciting places like New York and London and Paris. But I got Uzbekistan. The strange thing was, I did ask my editors, I said, look, I'm going to this place called Uzbekistan. It's being, paid for by these film distributors here. We're going to be taking an Australian film there, Far Lap. That was interesting. It had displayed Far Lap to Soviet audiences pre-perestroika. That was pretty weird. My editor said, look, Anna, no one wants to know about that part of the world. And I thought, oh, okay, yeah, I do. But and about that time, I was expecting my first child here, and I'm with my old uncle Vincenzo. Remember the guy that was, back in the 60s? And I went back to Italy for the first time. And I did write a piece called Once Upon a Country that was based on that first trip that I took to the Abruzzo, the very first trip. And this was very meaningful to me because it was from these steps that my mother had descended 20 years before the church in the main street of her village, Torino di Sangro. That photo was of a wedding that was taking place on the day when I happened to be walking past, and it struck me that these were the steps that my mother had taken as well. I have a brother-in-law who's Greek, and he's got his nonna's house is exactly the same, and many a person walked up to him and said, I have a house, my nonna has a house like that, we still have that. So yeah, this is in the little village of Polutri. This has now been, the land has gone, and this house is still there. It is now owned by a guy who makes small goods, and when I happened to be passing by, which is so weird, this happened twice now, 2 trips, and twice this guy has just happened to be going past as I'm going past my nonna's house in Polutri, and each time he's asked me back to have a glass of wine and some small goods, and he's so nice. I mean, really respectful and beautiful. And the gravestones, looking at the graveyards and contemplating the past. One sunny afternoon in Polutri, I am climbing a hillside, resting amongst stones and flowers. It's still and quiet in the village cemetery. Grass and wild daisies push through crackled old marble headstones. Bees hover in the sweet, heavy air. I am looking for my grandparents' graves. The trees planted by my grandmother are still flowering over the crumbling old well. Ana de la Pena. I never knew her. There's some other things through the graveyard. My grandfather and other things that I took photos of. Now, come to this part of the talk, I'm going to talk about the open door because it marks a doorway. It's an old door from villages in the Abruzzo, and the doorway that I stepped through was that of children, having children, and these are my two little girls when they were little. They are now 28 and 25. And later on, we had a young lad called Ben, and he's here tonight, and I think he's actually looking at his grandmother's poems for the very first time, so it's very nice that you could invite me here tonight and have an opportunity for the next generation to know their heritage as well. But in trying to respond to the challenges of motherhood and to do the work that we're expected to do as women, it's the times, the 80s, the 90s, when we're supposed to have it all, and it's very difficult to do. Journalism was not the kind of world that I could easily manage with 3 children. Maybe 2 was fine, 3 was difficult. And my mood at the time is best summed up by this. This meme, which is, has anybody seen my sanity? Because for a while I really kind of lost it in terms of managing everything that's to do with family life. The constant production of writing to a deadline, incredibly unsatisfying, and I began to write on a different level and do other kinds of writing. And also, I really needed to, I felt, go and study, go back to university, and I did some studies in counselling because I became aware of the great potential for writing in working with people in distress, carers groups, working with people with disabilities. I just realised that I loved teaching. I was connected to people, and this is one of the case studies that I had to do for my counselling project. And as you will see, we're encouraged in the diploma of counselling that I did was done at Uniting Care, and we use a method that is very much called systemic. So it's all about systems and the family systems and how people pass on intergenerational relationships, intergenerational themes, intergenerational problems. And so this is the kind of thing that I really enjoyed and enjoy studying. This is a fictional case study, by the way. And so in 2007, my husband got a teaching exchange in London. We actually ended up spending half a year in London, and part of that was going on the road and seeing Italy. But during that time, before we left, I was under great stress because both my parents died within 18 months of each other. And we had a problem. And the problem was to do with their wedding rings. None of us wanted to claim those rings, so Lydia and Dom's thick gold bands sat in a velvet-lined box. And given that Lydia had organised against all cultural expectations that she would not be buried next to her husband, nothing personal, she said to me, I just want my own space. It just seemed wrong to keep those rings confined. I know, yeah, it's true. Uncomfortably bumping up, she really missed her era, I think, Nonna, yeah. Uncomfortably bumping up against each other into eternity, which is how, in May in 2007, I ended up in a van in the Apennine Mountains of the Abruzzo, as you can see, negotiating hairpin bends with my brother Nick, my husband, and our 3 children. They were then 2 teenage girls and a 9-year-old boy at the time. We were looking for a burial place, and a hardware store where we could buy a spade, a short-handled mattock and a trowel, and maybe some gloves, a few large stones, or a couple of those terracotta plant markers. And the kids were going, oh, why are we doing this crazy shit? Are we there yet? No, we are not there yet, because we don't know exactly where there is going to be, and we might not ever reach civilization again unless Dad stops driving further and further up the mountains and either lets Uncle Nick read the map properly or allows me to ask a local, albeit in my crap Abruzzese dialect, where the hell we are. As for why we're doing this crazy shit, I guess it's because Nonna and Nonno were born in a time and place when poor people like them didn't have much say in what happened to them. So what we wanted to do with their wedding rings is return them to the place where it all started, somewhere here in these mountains. So began the journey of the return of the rings. It was like a Tolkien journey. I got this photo from the archives, internet, of refugees somewhere in southern Italy in World War II. And here is a photo of my mother. It's around the time when she wrote a poem called Night of the Long Harvest. If you get her book, you'll read. It's a poem about a night that they spent shucking corn. It had started at dawn the previous day, where they crossed the Ascende River at dawn to harvest their corn and take it back to their farmhouse and then spend the rest of the day and into the night shucking the corn. And at the time, to keep them awake, their brother Peppino tells them a ghost story, a story of the giant Magnatutto. And it's a story of a devilish giant who holds who gets his own back on a convent full of dastardly monks who try to rob Magnatutto of his heritage. And at the end of it, this ghost story is so scary that they realise that the end of the night has come and dawn has risen and they've magically shucked all the corn. So Peppino's cunning story had kept them awake. Now this was a lovely story that my mother used to tell me time and time again. True story. But I often wondered, why all night? Why did they spend all night doing this thing? I mean, why couldn't they do it in stages? And then I thought about the war. I don't know, but it was, this is my mother and her sister, and I might go back and focus on the war. And this is what I discovered. Those days and nights of the story of Magnatutto unfolded in late spring. But of course, in the children's version of her story, the exact year and the historical details were taken out because such tales were designed to amuse her children and distract her. And, you know, when we were teenagers, we were preoccupied with fitting into another culture. We were not listening to a middle-aged Italian immigrant lady with poor health and a difficult personality. And it was only as adults that we figured out that the night of the long harvest that my mother writes about in her book may have occurred in 1943. It sort of adds up for us. On the 3rd of September 1943, the Allies invaded the Italian mainland. The invasion coinciding with an armistice made with the Italians, who then re-entered the war on the Allied side. And soon, the villages of the Abruzzo became the central battlefield in the fight between the Germans and the Allied forces, with Rommel against Montgomery along the Gustav Line. Whole villages and towns were literally razed to the soil by the American bombings in the famous long battle of the Sangro River. Probably not a good time to be 13 years old on a farm on one of the colle outside Torino di Sangro. We knew them simply as I bombardamenti, dramatic catalysts that began Lydia's stories or as a part of the uneasy balance of her settings. And in the tradition of the long-suffering contadini of southern Italy, Lydia turned for solace to archetypal religious imagery, ancient paganistic beliefs, and an Abruzzese fatalism almost Zen-like in its practice of the art of acceptance. While villages around them fell, Torino di Sangro, she told us gravely, survived the bombings due to the intervention of La Madonna di Loreto, whose protective mantle lay over the town that spilled gently down the mountains 7 kilometres onto its own beach. I think that Magna Tutto was like the sum of Lydia's Abruzzo, both mountains and people, a mighty, stolid and slow, but with a relentless drive to have a fair share of a decent life. Nothing fancy, solo pane and a place to live in exchange for an honest, somewhat crude ring, a ring of loyalty and blessing as well as power. I think that essential harvest of the late August, that story that she tells over and over about the night of the long harvest, before the tanks of war rolled in September 1943, because under their farmhouse in the Campagna and in their townhouse in the village, Lydia's family must have staked their lives on that corn being safely stored, as did many others in underground shelters where women, food, animals, prisoners of war, refugees from across the Gustav Line and others on the run were hiding, trying to survive the Battle of the Sangro. So I think that is the story behind Night of the Long Harvest, and that's why they were doing that corn all night. Beautiful food at a cousin festival that we had last year. I went back to Italy and our cousins all met up and we drew on napkins bits of the family story that we personally knew of. And at the end of that wonderful night, we kind of had a family tree put together. And making my own relationship to Italy is really important. Getting to know my cousins, getting to know these families that I've gone back to now once every 2 years on my own terms, with my own family. And one of the great pleasures is seeing the third generation getting to know each other and talking to each other and emailing each other and speaking English and speaking Italian, and it's all moving on. Now, do you want to know what we did with the rings? Well, I'm going to tell you. Normally I say to people, I'm not going to tell you you have to buy my book, but I'm going to tell you tonight what we did. There's a beautiful town called Roccascalegna. Does anyone know that town in Abruzzo? It's a magical town. I think that if Magna Tutto, the giant, existed, I think that his hat, he must have dropped his hat onto the mountaintop and it became a castle, because they have a castle in the air, a literal castle that is dropped on top of a mountain like a witch's hat or the hat of Magna Tutto. So Il Castello di Roccascalegna is truly a castle in the air. This is the town, the medieval town, and this is the castle in the winter. Now I've seen it from many different views. My view of it was in the spring, but due to being a writer, I mushed a few facts together, and I'm in a kind of slightly different season in this story, but still, I have been there. This is in the winter, the witch's hat on the castle, and this is in the summer, and you can go right up there, you can climb the battlements, and here is the pathway down to the medieval church, and up from the battlements, looking down upon the medieval church, it seems, I'll read you what we decided, it seems I've never been up so high. From the valley, the 11th century castle in the old town of Roscosacalenia looks like a witch's hat, thrown by Magnotuto in exasperation, leaving it and the town behind it like a cloak, perched impossibly on one of the first of the two limestone formations that rear up from the valley floor. Beneath the castello, the medieval Chiesa di San Pietro hovers in the still air, and the great iron bells of the church are silent. Yet something is ringing inside my head. My brother is beside me taking photos. He stops as well. You know, I say to him, I think we've been a bit obsessed with the land, earth, digging, underground, soil, dirt. Yes, he says, it's all so heavy, so weighed down. We look down on the ridges of the Apennines, flowing like white waves into the horizon. This is spring and there are the green waves. And we look at each other. We're agreed. We'll have to Skype our sister in Australia to discuss it, but we're pretty sure she'll think it best as well. And we know exactly what to do with the rings. And that evening, the last of the 2000 trip, we ordered pizzas. I know what to do with the rings. This is my Sound of Music moment. I know what I'm going to do. Yeah, this is on the way back from Rocascalenia. And this was a very special moment of meditation that I spent down in the valley, thinking about the rings. Anyway, that evening we ate pizza from town because everyone was too tired to cook, and my daughters were on Facebook to my various cousins' children. My son says that they're first cousins once removed, and I'm careful to hide my joy at these new relationships because their growth on what I thought was an all but dead European family tree. But my brother and I walk over to sit with my uncle. It's time to explain to Zio what we've been doing and what we decided. We have to ask you something, says my brother. We need your help. The day before, I'd walked again with my uncle through the hills to the Cimitero Inglese, the Sangro River Cemetery. It's a quiet temple of thousands of meticulously tended white gravestones circling around lawns through paths of magnolia and hawthorn hedges. And as I look down on those 2,616 Commonwealth burials of the Battle of the Sangro, he weeps and holds my hand, and I think back onto his war, away on another front while his sisters fought theirs, the Nazis coming down from the north through villages and fields, and the Allied forces pushing through from the south, of tanks, shelling, machine gun fire, bombardamenti, the earth dust, the bodies piled in gullies and trenches, the Bailey bridges over the Sangro, the refugees fleeing with their animals from road to village, and above the Allied aircraft. And my uncle, who has his own Night of the Long Scarves, which is on a DVD of a fiery anti-war speech which he gives to the crowds outside the Comune di Torino in the Piazza Donato Iesi on the Italian Liberation Day, which, like Anzac Day, is on April 25, but that's another story. Sadly, for some souls, what's left behind for mind and memory to process is just as hard as, possibly harder than these words of my mother's. She said at the end, in one of her poems, she said, "When I was a farmer under the beating sun, my thoughts flew elsewhere, of changing country, changing jobs. It was then that I signed up to be a migrant, to cross the ocean, a journey of hope, of another world. I didn't know what I would find, but I thought there couldn't be times harder than those I left behind." And then there are the words that we inscribed on her grave. She said, "Friends, don't ask if you feel at ease in this land. None of that matters. What matters is courage." So, should a traveller arrive in Torino di Sangro one fine spring Sunday at the end of May, they will find themselves in the middle of the Festa della Madonna di Loreto. And from that 13th century chiesa A procession of men as strong as giants will carry on their shoulders Our Lady, whose heavy mantle is covered in offerings and blessings of gold and money from the faithful. And as Maria Santissima di Loreto weaves down the Corso Lauretano, her cloak will sparkle with 2 newly pinned golden wedding rings from a land far, far away. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sure you'll all agree that was a very interesting talk, and I've actually ordered the book of this one here, Songs of the Suitcase, which you can buy online, and unfortunately it hasn't arrived, but I'm really looking forward to getting it and reading, because it all sounds very, very good. And I'd like to thank you very much.
Did your mother ever express to you at all what dreams that she had as a young girl and or as a young woman, that anything that she really wanted to do that she never got to do? Did she ever have a conversation like that with you at all?
I think what she wanted to do most of all was go home, to find home. However, I think there was something inside her that would have been, that would have found a more receptive, that would have been better grown in a more receptive milieu of the 1960s. Had she been born in the 60s and 70s, Italy, she would have, I think, definitely had an education, been and gone on and done really well in that.
Were there any other writers in the family at all, going back that you traced?
Look, the storytellers in my family, it's insane.
Wow.
There's one brother who went to Switzerland. I met him, I actually looked him up. He's the Peppino of the Night of the Long Harvest, and he was the official storyteller that people in the village knew as a storyteller. And it's sort of like, it's actually like a fairy tale, because he did actually make shoes in the village. He was a shoemaker,
oh, wow.
just like in the fairy tales. However, he, when I met him in Basel, he was quite embittered about the smallness of the village and the lack of opportunity that he had, and he felt that one of his strategies was to go into the church and become educated, and then he didn't take his vows. He left, and that may have caused problems in the family. I don't know. There's a lot of cut-off in the family as well, like a lot of not seeing people for years and dramas about land, you know, the usual Italian thing of I'm not speaking to you now for the rest of my life, and that place.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Purple C39, purple C55, purple C30, C34, sorry, 34.
Thank you very much. This is a small gift of thanks. Can we all say thank you very much?